So we've got 2 talks between now and the lunch break, and the first speaker is Dr. Fiona Kyle, who, when you received this grant, you were at City University London, weren't you? And you're now at UCL, based at the Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Centre. And in fact, we need a picture of you there, just in case you can't see Fiona. Another shorty.
I am quite small.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've got all the short speakers up first. So Fiona's project, so the grant that she received from the Heather van der Lely Trust was called Using the Gaps to Identify Preschool Deaf Children at Risk of Later Literacy Difficulties. Heather herself, I don't think, worked with deaf children, so it's wonderful that you've extended the population of children.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here this morning, or now this afternoon, to talk to you about the results from our Heather van der Lely funded study. And we're very grateful to the Heather van der Lely Foundation for funding this study and actually for funding our research with deaf children. And so I'd like to acknowledge Ros Herman, the co-I on the project, is sitting over there. So she's had a huge part in this study. And I'm going to talk to you this morning about our findings of using the GAPS, so the Grammar and Phonology Screening Test, with preschool deaf and hearing children. Now, what I also want to acknowledge right at the beginning is I work at DCAL, which is the Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Centre at UCL. And at DCAL, we believe that all deaf children should have early exposure to a fully accessible language. Now, in this talk, I'm only going to be talking about spoken language outcomes because that's what we've looked at in this study. But many of the deaf children who've taken part in our study have exposure to BSL in different extents, and a handful of them actually are BSL and BSL/English bilingual bimodals, which are really exciting. So I just want you to be aware of that at the beginning. So spoken language outcomes vary widely in deaf and hard of hearing children. And a lot of studies are now reporting age-appropriate global language skills in deaf children, which is really exciting. And I want to look at some of these results with you. So we know from the Tomlin study that hard of hearing children, now hard of hearing children are children who have mild, moderate or severe levels of deafness. In their study, they found that hard of hearing children had similar language scores to their hearing peers at age 8. But actually, the picture changed when you looked at the severity of deafness, because although within that group they had age-appropriate language skills, actually the children who had severe levels of deafness had poorer language outcomes. And Werfel and colleagues found recently that the average omnibus language score, standardised language score, was for deaf and hard of hearing children at age 4 was 90. Now, 90 is within the normal range. But what was really important in that study, because they also included some carefully matched typically developing hearing children, actually, the typically developing hearing children had a mean omnibus language score of 115. So while the deaf and hard of hearing children were in the normal range, actually they still were significantly delayed compared to their hearing peers. And you can see from this graph here from their study, so the top line is the children with typical hearing, the bottom line is the deaf and hard of hearing children, and you can see that while both groups made progress during the 3-year study, actually the children with the deaf and hard of hearing children do not catch up with their hearing peers. I think it's a really nice graph to show that. And in another recent study, from the US, Antia and colleagues found that 44% of deaf children had scores in the typical range for their language, for their vocabulary. And this is much higher proportions than we've seen in previous studies. But actually, the mean vocabulary score for the children in this study was 83, which is below outside of that typical range. But it's important to also, the children in this study, actually, they included children from across the range of language preferences. So they had children who used only spoken English, they had bilingual bimodals, and they had children who only used sign. So what's really clear from these is that actually there's still a lot of variation in language outcomes. What about spoken language outcomes for children with cochlear implants? So many studies are reporting that children with cochlear implants achieve language skills comparable to their hearing peers. Savant and colleagues found that the average spoken language scores of children with cochlear implants were within the normal range. But again, they are within the normal range, which is really exciting. But I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact that although it's in the normal range, that is at the lower end of the normal range. And Lund carried out a meta-analysis of vocabulary knowledge in children with cochlear implants and found that when they were compared with hearing peers, that they had lower levels of vocabulary. So while I think we need to be positive, and it is exciting that actually we are getting higher levels of higher proportions of deaf children who have spoken language outcomes within the normal range, what we have to be aware of the fact is that although they're in the normal range, they're typically at the lower end of the normal range, and if their hearing peers are achieving language scores at the higher end of that normal range, then actually should we really be describing this as age appropriate? It feels as if there's still a discrepancy, there's still an achievement gap that we need to address. So there are two things we need to do if we want to improve spoken language outcomes in deaf and hard of hearing children. To improve the spoken language outcomes, we need to firstly understand the variation in their outcomes. And secondly, we need a way of identifying early those deaf children who are likely to have language difficulties so that we can provide appropriate support with them. Because as you've seen, there is a lot of variation. And so Ros Herman and I were absolutely thrilled when the Heather Van der Lely Foundation agreed to fund our preschool language and literacy longitudinal study, in which one of our main questions was, how are individual differences in preschool spoken language abilities related to later language and literacy outcomes? And to do this, we've been running a longitudinal study. So we recruited children into the study at time 1 when they were in preschool, so they're aged 3 to 4. We would see them a year later in reception when they're aged 4 to 5. We'd see them again at the end of year 1 when they're aged 5 to 6. And at the end of the study, they would be in year 2, which is the end of Key Stage 1, as you know, and that was time 4. And then we had this lovely design, so we thought we'll be able to look at development between the different time points, and we'll be able to look at it from the beginning to the end. Apologies, I've got a terrible cough. I'm hoping that I'll be able to get through this. But also, one of the other questions that we really wanted to be able to answer with this longitudinal design was, can we screen at preschool for deaf children who are likely to go on to develop later language or literacy difficulties? And this is really important because actually lots of the children who are using spoken language will be going into mainstream settings. And when they're going into mainstream settings, they'll have support from speech and language therapists and teachers of the deaf, but actually their primary educators may not really know much about deafness at all. And so it's really important if we could flag to them, okay, these children might need a bit more support over the first few years. That would be really important for practitioners. So Ros and I were interested in whether we could use the grammar and phonology screening test, the GAPS, with deaf children. So as probably most of you know, people have talked about the GAPS a little bit so far. The GAPS is a 10-minute screener that's been designed to be used by practitioners. It assesses phonological and grammatical skills through 2 different subtests, one requiring sentence repetition and one for non-word repetition. And these skills, as you know, are known to be clinical markers for language difficulties. Now, the premise of GAPS is that GAPS has this alien called BIC. And the administrator, the tester, tells the children that they're going to tell them a story. And BIC also wants to hear the story, but BIC can only understand children. And so the idea is that we'll tell the story to the child, and then the child repeats it to BIC. And they like this. Now, the first part of the first subtest is a sentence repetition subtest. So you say a sentence to the child, and the sentences have an accompanying picture book. So, for example, so it's akin to telling the children a story. So the cat with the bell is happy. the milk is pulled by the dog, and the children repeat those sentences to Bic. Now, the words that are underlined are the key words that have to be correct for the child to get a correct score on this test. And there's also a second component, the second subtest is the non-word repetition subtest, and there are 8 words, and the children are told, now we're going to say some of Bic's words to him. So remember, this is a screener. So actually, this is supposed to be just a 10-minute screener. This isn't a really long involved, it's not like we're administering the early repetition battery or something that takes a long time to administer. Now, when we're talking about a screener, there are 2 key things that we need to know about. So we need to know about the sensitivity and the specificity. And the sensitivity it measures the test's ability to correctly identify children with the condition, whereas the specificity measures the test's ability to correctly identify children without the condition. Now, together, both sensitivity and specificity provide a comprehensive view of a test's diagnostic accuracy. And ideally, you would both want sensitivity and specificity to be as high as possible. When we're thinking about using it as a screen for the sensitivity and specificity for screeners, several papers have argued that a realistic threshold for both sensitivity and specificity is 0.8 or 80%. Now, the GAPS has not been used with deaf children previously, and the results with hearing children are rather mixed. So the GAPS has been found to be a valid assessment of grammar and phonology in several studies because performance on the GAPS was highly correlated with performance on more gold standard assessments of sentence repetition and non-word repetition. When it was used in a study in which children had already been identified as having DLD, or actually it would have been SLI at that time, it was found to have excellent sensitivity and specificity. But when it was used in another study as a general screener with typically developing children in mainstream nurseries and schools, it was found to have low sensitivity, but it had high specificity. Now, this paper had quite a large sample size, but the sample size actually was spread across preschool, reception, and year 1. And it was analysed all across those 3 groups. And as we learnt in our first presentation today, we know how much language skills develop over those first couple of years of schooling. So we wondered whether actually what the results would be if we looked at this with deaf children and hearing children and actually looked at them in preschool rather than across all, lumping all the children together. And so we set out to answer one of our questions, which was, can we use the GAPS to identify preschool deaf children and hearing children at risk of literacy and language difficulties? So we did this as part of our preschool language and literacy study, which I've already briefly introduced you to. In this study, what we did at time 1, we gave children a huge battery of language assessments. So we looked at the usual suspects that we would, such as vocabulary, but we also gave them broader language assessments as well. So we looked at children's receptive grammar, children's expressive grammar. We looked at their sentence repetition, their non-word and word repetition. We also looked at their emergent literacy skills. So we looked at their letter sound knowledge, their print concepts, their phonological awareness. And then as they progressed through the study, we then included reading outcomes, and that's both word reading, reading comprehension, and also spelling outcomes. So today, what I'm going to focus on is this second question here about screening at preschool for children who might have difficulties. So we planned a lovely 2-wave longitudinal study, and I can see by the looks on lots of your faces, you know where I'm probably going to go with this. So we had, in 2019, we recruited a lovely sample to the study of deaf and hearing children in preschool. And in spring 2020, we were all geared up. We had the schools booked in again to go back and start going back and see these children. And also, we were in the process of recruiting a second wave. And we were really excited because we were already in the schools, and the teachers had really enjoyed actually finding out more broad, more detailed language assessments for the children. So they were really keen for children who were upcoming to take part in this study as well. But obviously COVID hit, and so the schools closed, and we just couldn't get the data. But also what that meant was that wiped out our wave 2 children completely. And then, thanks to COVID, this actually turned out to, in the end, to be a 4-wave longitudinal study. And for those with eagle eyes, you can see where that end date is on the far right, so you can probably see where I'm going to go with this. What happened in 2021 was that the schools reopened, but actually UCL Ethics would not allow us to go in and collect data from the schools. However, we had some lovely speech and language therapists and teachers who were working with the children, and they agreed to administer a short battery of tests for us from our large battery. We also recruited into the study a smaller group of deaf children, and again, we had speech and language therapists who administered just a handful of the tests for us. And then in 2022, we recruited a 3rd wave, and in 2023, we recruited our 4th wave, and then we decided for our sanity we would just stop at that point. And the idea with the multi-wave study is that then you collapse the data across those 4 waves based upon the time points. And so at each time point, so at time 1, the children, regardless of which wave they are in, they were always the same age when they entered the study, and they were given all the same tests. Now, for the purpose of what I'm mainly going to talk about today, I'm going to focus on data from time 1 data from wave 1, 3 and 4, and that's because we've got the complete data sets from those children. So, we managed to recruit to the study 235 preschool children aged between 3 to 4 years, and that's across the 4 waves of the study. Okay. Something seems to have gone a little bit funny with the formatting there, but I think it's okay. So we recruited 122 deaf children who use spoken language and 113 hearing children. Their mean age was 4 years, 3 months at the start of the study. Now, we were looking for deaf children with severe and profound levels of deafness, but actually it turned out that 21 of them had moderate levels of deafness, but we kept them in the study. Now, all the deaf children were used in spoken English, but actually, as you might expect, over half of them had some knowledge or some exposure to BSL. And so we're writing this, we're deliberately vague with how we're writing this. We're writing this as access to sign language, because I think it's really important that we don't have an assessment of BSL skill in this study. And so it's really important that actually we don't confuse the issue with BSL skill and knowledge with BSL exposure. But what is lovely is that 7 of these children are bilingual bimodal, so they are developing fluency in both of those languages. Just under 2/3 of them had cochlear implants. And what is also really exciting about this study is it's an inclusive sample. And what we mean by that is we did not exclude on the basis of nonverbal IQ, on the basis of significant additional difficulties, or on the basis of children being exposed to another spoken language at home. And the reasoning for this was that when we were recruiting for this study, we were talking with teachers of the deaf, and they were really quite strong about how they felt sometimes about reading research studies that would be really interesting, but sometimes the samples that they would have in the studies just don't match the caseload of children that they're working with. And so that when we have our research studies that we only have deaf children with nonverbal IQ in the normal range, they're not EAL children at all, that just wasn't really reflecting the children that they are working with. So we decided that we'd be inclusive within reason. So actually what this means is we've got children who have diagnoses of other additional difficulties, but they were all able to attempt the tests. And we made those decisions in conjunction with the teachers. And what this means is also that our children were exposed, some of the children were exposed to different languages at home. So, given that we've got this inclusive sample, I want to first of all show you that actually, at the group level, deaf children in our sample had scores in the normal range for non-verbal IQ and for English vocabulary. Now, these are violin plots, so just to sort of orientate you if you're not sure about it, the idea is, so what you've got here, it's showing the pattern of the distribution is being shown in that it's a sort of frequency of the scores around those particular regions of scores. So what you can see here, and we've got the cutoff for below 1 standard deviation on both. So the English vocabulary is standard scores, so the cutoff is 85. The non-verbal IQ is a T score, so the cutoff is below 40. So as a group, we can say that the deaf children in this study, they had relative strengths in these two skills, particularly because it was this inclusive sample. But what you can really see from here immediately is that there's far more variation in the deaf children's non-verbal IQ scores and in the vocabulary. And that's to be expected because we have this inclusive sample. So there's a lot more variation for the deaf children. But the average scores, their mean scores at the group level, are within the normal range. But still, compared to their hearing peers who were coming from similar schools, the hearing children were achieving higher scores than the deaf children. We had looked at their profiles across a range of standardised language scores. And what we can see is that once we start looking across broader language scores, actually, deaf children were showing quite uneven profiles across these standardised language scores, and their skills were not typically at age appropriate at the group level. So at the group level, we can see that they've got significant weaknesses on the CALF sentence structure, so that's measuring language comprehension and its receptive grammar, and also on the preschool CALF word structure, so that's expressive morphosyntax. And when we look at their performance on the gaps, so this is reporting the percentiles. We can see that, again, they've got weaknesses, deaf children have got weaknesses in their sentence and non-word repetition skills, compared to their hearing peers. But what I really wanted you to take away from this is just how much individual variation there is within the deaf children that we're working with. And lots of these children were just about to go and start in mainstream schools. So, is the GAPS valid for use with deaf children? So let's have a look at the psychometrics of the GAPS in our sample. So actually, we find that the GAPS has good reliability for both deaf and hearing children, which we were very pleased about. And it also has good criterion validity. So what we mean by that is it measuring what we think it's measuring? And how we look at that is we look at performance, we look at the correlation between performance on the GAPS and other tests that are known to measure sentence repetition and word repetition from the early repetition battery, and also performance correlating with the preschool CALF. So we know that the GAPS has got good sensitivity. We know that the GAPS has got, I've got ahead of myself, the GAPS has got good reliability, it's got good validity, but the important question is, does it have sensitivity and specificity as a screener? And giving you the headline of this, for deaf children, GAPS has 95% sensitivity and 75% specificity. And for hearing children in preschool, GAPS has 80% sensitivity and 88% specificity. So that's the headline. What I now want to do is show you the detail a little bit so we can think about it. So how we've looked at this, I'll orientate you to this. So we had complete data sets in terms of GAPS and the CALF for 92 deaf children and 104 hearing children. So then what we want to do is we want to look at their performance using the sentence structure and the word structure from the preschool CALF. So we've used those as the criterion test. And we administered those tests and we wanted to know how many of the children scored below 1 standard deviation across those two tests. And what we can see here is that 60 out of the 92 deaf children scored below 1 standard deviation across those two preschool CALF. And then what we want to know is how good is it the gaps at identifying the same children? And what we can see here is that the gaps picks up 57 out of those 60 deaf children. And then when we want to look at the specificity, we want to look at, so according to the preschool CALF, 32 of those 92 deaf children did not have difficulties. And we want to know how many of those 32 were correctly identified by the gaps as not having difficulties. And that's where we get 24, which then gives us this 75% specificity. And we can do the same for the hearing children. Now, what we've done here, we've looked at their performance on the gaps, whether they have failed either of the gap subtests. So that could be the sentence repetition or the non-word repetition. But actually, what we're using as the criterion test, i.e. to compare it against, comparing performance on the gaps to, we're comparing it to the preschool CALF word structure and sentence structure, which are both measuring grammatical skills. So what we then did was look to see how good is the gaps in terms of as a screener if we just look at the gaps sentence only. And what we find here is that it has roughly comparable accuracy, but what it does this time, it decreases the sensitivity, but it increases the specificity for deaf children. And for hearing children, it remains the same for the sensitivity, but again, it increases the specificity. So, is the GAPS a valid screener of language difficulties for deaf and hearing children? I think what we can say is that the GAPS has potential as a preschool screener, but what is it a screener of? So we've been comparing it, the criterion tests that we've been used are looking at grammatical difficulties, and so therefore the GAPS has high sensitivity and specificity as a preschool screener for concurrent grammatical difficulties in deaf children. It has slightly less specificity, slightly less sensitivity, but better specificity with the hearing children in preschool. And we'd wondered whether it has higher sensitivity for deaf and hard of hearing children simply due to, possibly one reason is because of the higher prevalence of grammatical difficulties in the deaf and hard of hearing children that we were seeing. Because if you remember, 60 of those 92 children were coming up as having grammatical difficulties according to the preschool CALF. But I think there are a few issues or a few points for discussion that we should think about. So firstly, we're reporting results when we have been administering these tests by trained researchers in research conditions. So actually, does it still have validity when it's used by teachers or practitioners? Because that's the whole point, that's one of the main reasons behind Heather developing that test. And actually, we find from our initial results that it does have validity from teachers and practitioners. We've looked at this in two slightly different ways. We have got some practitioners to score our videos of the children in their own settings. So we had administered the test, we'd scored it, we've shown them the videos and they've scored it, and we identified the same children as having difficulties. There was a little bit, we didn't get exactly the same scores, but we picked up the same children, which I think is the important thing. We also, what we wanted then to do, we were hoping to have lots of practitioners also administer the test. And unfortunately, we do have some data, but schools are really busy, and they said they were going to do this, and they tried, and actually we wanted this to be done before the summer holidays last year, and a lot of them, they in the end, they didn't all do it. So we do have some data, and again, it has very good, the same sensitivity and specificity as ours. We just don't have, it's only from 15 children, and we wanted it obviously to be more. So we're thinking about how else we can look at this. But also, what about longer term prediction and accuracy? So I've been talking about the results in terms of assessing the children at preschool and looking for concurrent difficulties. But if you remember, one of our questions was really, can we screen at preschool for those children who will have later language or literacy difficulties? And we, as you know, as you saw from the design of the study, we're not going to have all the time for data for another couple of years. So we have the data from the Wave 1 children who have completed the study. And actually, for those children, we do have good sensitivity for deaf children. So actually, we've looked at it in two ways. So first of all, we've got some preliminary results looking at using the gaps at preschool and screening for grammatical difficulties a year later at the end of reception. And that's where we've got 94% sensitivity for deaf children and similar for hearing children. But we want to wait, because that's only with one wave of the children, we want to wait until we have the next wave of children through so that we've got a larger sample size before we would have more confidence in that. Also, with our Wave 1 children, what we find is that the test has very good sensitivity and specificity from preschool, picking up children with reading comprehension difficulties at the end of year 2. But again, it's a smaller sample size, so the results are looking really good. But what you have to remember is that when you've got smaller sample sizes and you've only got a handful of children who've got these difficulties, your sensitivity and specificity figures can change rapidly. So, for example, we have 100% sensitivity for hearing children from preschool, looking preschool gaps to reading comprehension difficulties at the end of year 2, but there was only one child who had reading comprehension difficulties at the end of year 2. And the gaps picked that child up, which is great. But that's why I haven't actually put those figures up on here, because we just have to wait until we have more data so that we can talk properly about those results. And I think so our mantra has a lot been, good science is slow science. And so it's looking good, but we have to just be cautious with this. And also, when is the best time to screen? So actually, is it better to screen at is it better to screen at preschool, or actually should you leave it until the end of reception, where then at least we know that so much changes over that first year of formal schooling. And so that is still a question mark until we get more of the data in. So, to sum this all up, what's clear from the data so far, even though I focused just on the screening data, it's clear that spoken language outcomes vary considerably for deaf children. And that's both those children with cochlear implants and children without. And what's clear is that if by just looking at their vocabulary scores, and also I didn't report their letter sound knowledge scores, again, were in the normal range at the group level. So these are children who are going into mainstream classes in reception, and they have, at the group level, they've got good vocabulary, they've got good letter sound knowledge. But actually, what's clear from us looking at their broader language skills, they've got some hidden delays in spoken language skills, which we feel are likely to play in a role later on with their reading comprehension difficulties that we often see. And so therefore, early intervention is key for deaf children using spoken language. But in order to be able to provide early intervention, we need to be able to identify those children who need the intervention. Our data suggests that GAPS accurately identifies deaf and hearing children using that 0.8 with and without grammatical difficulties by measuring these two skills, grammatical and phonological skills. But what I really want you to take home from this, it's essential to be specific about these results. So we have used because of the criterion tests that we've used, which are 2 tests looking at grammatical skills, we are looking at screening for grammatical difficulties. We can't talk about our results for the gaps in terms of screening for DLD, because that's just not what we have looked at in terms of the criterion. And I think we have to be really clear about what we have and what we haven't found. Also, what we're waiting to find out is how important are grammatical difficulties in preschool for their later reading comprehension and later grammatical skills. And hopefully we will have those answers in a couple of years' time. As you know, we're following these children up in this longitudinal study, but I'd also like to take this wonderful opportunity to announce, actually, that to thank the Heather Vandelay Foundation for funding our preschool language and literacy study, because we've got really exciting results. But actually, this has also led to us just being awarded a £1 million grant from the ESRC to actually follow up some of these children, the Wave 1 children, and we're going to be able to follow them up from year 4, 5 and 6 and look at what skills enable some of those children to become successful readers. And we'll have all their preschool language skills. So we can really answer those questions about preschool through to the end of year 6, which is just going to be absolutely incredible. And so I think we have to be, in terms of recommendations, I think we need to be cautious until we get all the data in. But I think our results suggest that the GAPS does have potential as a preschool grammatical screener for practitioners to maybe use with deaf and hard of hearing children. And I would like to thank the Heather Vandelay Foundation. I'd like to thank my wonderful co-I, Ros Herman, our fabulous postdoc, Dr. Katie Mason, who has a poster at lunchtime, and Indy Beattie was one of our research assistants, and a couple of the students who have worked on the data with us. So thank you.